Hello and welcome to lesson 6. So this is going to be the final lesson of our cycle of lectures for art history, and it's also going to be a little bit of a longer lesson because it's going to cover different topics. We will start with feminist art, which is going to be a rather big chapter in this lesson. So we will talk about feminist art, about photorealism, the pictures generation, Neo-Expressionism, young British artists, and we will also talk a little bit about time-based art, so more contemporary approaches by contemporary artists. So in terms of chronology, we start with feminist art, so we are talking about the end of 60s, beginning of 70s, and of course there are some connections with performance art and with conceptual art that we discussed in the previous lessons, and then we will continue through the 80s and the 90s more specific with the young British artists, and then we will also discuss a little the work of a few, we could say, contemporary artists, although some of these artists that we say contemporary artists, they actually started their work, for example, around the 70s, or have some influences from the work developed at this time. And for example, Marina Abramovich, who we discussed already in the lessons before. I will refer to her again now in a different context, not specifically about performance art, but about feminist art, and also regarding the work of contemporary artists. So starting with feminist art, as a movement, as an artistic movement, it appeared in the late 60s, as I mentioned before. So as I have mentioned also in the context of performance art and conceptual art, feminist art appeared really in this context of civil protests and of anti-war protests, and most of all a desire for equality in terms of the rights of women and human rights, but in the case of feminist art, specifically dedicated to the rights of women. So feminist artists from the beginning, they want to work with what are perceived as the stereotypes related to gender roles. What are the societal expectations on the roles of women, of how women should behave, should dress, what kind of institutions should be supported by actions of women. So basically the role of women in society. This was also expressed in the work or manifested in the work by many feminist artists by the use of non-traditional media, and often by the use of media which have not been very well established. So some feminist artists started to work with media, for example, in the 60s and 70s, which have not been established yet, such as video, or in some cases also photography, but also performance art, conceptual art. Some feminist artists were also interested in recovering, for example, traditions from crafts and materials and techniques which were traditionally associated to women, but in a derogatory way. So, for example, the use of crafts or the techniques of crafts like sewing, working with fabric, needlework. So this kind of things which were associated with women's work and normally invisible or unappreciated, mostly often through history, unpaid work. And so many feminist artists were interested in also in bringing these techniques and these ways of expression and creating artworks that incorporate these techniques as media, also as a medium of expression. So I will talk about a few examples. I will start with the work of Louise Bourgeois, She was, I would say, a proto-feminist artist, we could say, because her work started a little bit before this movement, feminist art as a movement. So she started before. She's French and she immigrated to the United States. But her work, which developed all through the end of the 20th century, was very influenced by her own personal experiences and dealt with very sensitive topics such as psychological trauma, but specifically dealt with the role of women and often the role of women in society in a domestic environment. So Louise Bourgeois worked a lot with the ideas of ambivalence between the gender. So what can be considered gender stereotypes, for example, the male associated with power and virility and strength, and the female associated with softness and vulnerability and fragility. And in her work, she mixed these ideas to develop or to reveal that these gender stereotypes are social constructs which are often imposed or advertised, so to say, by patriarchal systems, which in the end potentially create systems of oppression, and namely systems of oppression for women. So Louise Bourgeois, she transformed her own experiences, personal experiences in childhood. She went through a traumatic childhood in which she experienced conflict between the parents, a situation in which the father would be unfaithful to his mother in their own home. And some of these situations Louise Bourgeois has witnessed herself. So through her work, she really tried to, in many ways, exercise these very difficult feelings she had about the situation of womanhood, of being a woman, of being at home, of being under the oppressive power of a male-dominant agent, and also this topic of emotional abuse and emotional oppression. The work of Louise Bourgeois, and there is some examples you have on page 7, so I would recommend you to open the file, as I normally do. On page 7, we have here an example, Filet, where we see another aspect that was revolutionary and bold in Louise Bourgeois' work was that she was not afraid to deal explicitly with topics around sexuality, and she didn't explore them in a romanticized way. So she was interested also in some levels of she worked with Freudian archetypes, and she was interested in this kind of imagery. So it wasn't necessarily about creating beautiful images, but also about exploring these ideas of fear, these ideas of ambiguity. And as you see, for example, in the piece Filet, which is this huge suspended phallus, we see a phallus that really has a very plastic appearance, but it's also a kind of ambiguous figure that also suggests femininity, as it can look like a neck and breasts, so the testicles can also look like breasts. So there is a kind of hybridization between the male and the female, and between ideas of strength and vulnerability. And Louise Bourgeois also openly discussed that from a sexual point of view, she found the masculine genitals to be very delicate. So this is also a statement regarding some societal expectations on the role of men and how men should be seen and behave and should perform. So these issues are directly addressed through Louise Bourgeois' work. Regarding the personal subject matter, Louise Bourgeois was also very innovative because she opened the way for many artists, and specifically female artists, for an art genre which nowadays we can describe as confessional art. And this is a kind of art that deals directly with personal experiences, and often traumatic personal experiences, not just a way of self-expression, but as a way to transmit to society issues and situations which might happen also collectively, and so that the viewer, while experiencing this work, can have a sense of affinity for the work and also a sense of catharsis. So to find some kind of recognition in that situation, or even without feeling a recognition, through this process of empathy, understand the role or the situation of someone who has experienced certain conditions or certain situations. So in this case, for example, in page 8, we have the destruction of the father. And this is a piece that Louise Bourgeois created, in which she simulated a kind of a table, which she associated this idea of sitting at the table with the father as a total oppressive situation. So she created this environment in which the father is placed on the table, open wide, dissected and disemboweled. And she did this as a kind of gesture of defiance, and also as a kind of exorcism to the authority of this really negative, oppressive presence of the father. So there was this desire, a vengeful desire of retaliation for all the inflicted pain, and also coming to terms by creating a situation that in a way expresses all the feelings and all the pain and all the anger, but also brings a kind of sense of justice, that in the end it is possible to terminate, and it is possible to punish someone who is responsible for abuse. Another very important piece by Louise Bourgeois that also deals with this subject matter of her own experiences in childhood is called Maman, and Maman is a reference to her own mother, and Maman is a piece that has been created in different contexts, also different scales, but it works with the symbol of the spider. So Louise Bourgeois' mother was a weaver, which is also often skill in a profession which is associated with women, with women's work, and so she associated this archetype of the spider as the weaver, not as someone who is oppressed, but as a protective, intelligent, skillful figure. So Louise Bourgeois did not perceive her mother as a victim. She perceived her as an intelligent, protective woman who used her skill the best as possible in that context, in the context of her childhood. So we see this figure of Maman as a huge spider with very pointy, menacing legs, so to say. And we see this figure that we also experience ambivalently. That we can experience her as protective, but we can also experience her as menacing. And this feeling of menacing in the context of the work of Louise Bourgeois, of being a menacing female figure, is an expression of female power. And we see this spider in different contexts. For example, on page 12, we have another image of the spider in a different scale and in a different context. But this was an image that was explored by Louise Bourgeois very often. The next images, as you can see, Louise Bourgeois was also, artistically speaking, extremely important, because she was one of the first artists, and not just female artists, but one of the first artists to really explore installation as a medium, and she worked with installation in very hybrid ways. So she worked with objet trouvé, but also with made objects which were made, for example, of clay or other soft materials and fabrics. So materials that really expressed a lot of these ambivalences and ambiguities, but also had some kind of fleshy corporeal component. So she was very interested in this idea also of suggesting the human body, and the human body not necessarily as a place of fixed identities, but as a place also of ambiguity, of transformation, of a balance between strength and vulnerability. Often the pieces of Louise Bourgeois are also meant to create, to explore the uncanny, and this is a term also from Freud. The uncanny is this feeling or this aesthetic that makes us uncomfortable, that makes us deal with things that we might be afraid, but that at the same time we feel as familiar. And this is definitely a quality that Louise Bourgeois explored in her work. So, for example, in many of her installations, she creates these kind of cages which integrate objects as objects from domestic environments. So she wants to create these installations that show what we recognize as a domestic situation, but with this emotional subjective layer of the feelings that might be associated with these spaces. So in the work of Louise Bourgeois, we really see that she expresses architecture mostly as a potential place for the creation of claustrophobic situations, or a potential place for oppression or feelings of oppression. She worked with different media. She also worked a lot with drawing and with painting. And in her drawings and paintings, we see some influences also of surrealism, and we specifically see drawing and the use of color to make these allusions to feelings and to allusions of the human body, and also ideas of how the human body connects to other human bodies. So relationships, especially intimacy, was something that she was very interested in exploring in her work. So in page 17, for example, we have a sculpture called Fun. This one is from 2005. And in this sculpture, we see a female figure which is pregnant and suspended with a hook, suspended by her belly, so by the pregnant belly. And of course, this image can create a lot of different associations, and obviously deals with this idea of motherhood, and of how Louise Bourgeois, all her life, she was also a mother besides being an artist, and it was difficult for her to establish a balance between these roles, since she was also one of the first female artists who was really struggling to find her own artistic voice, and not be dependent on a certain art group or following specific movements. So she was very interested in creating her own artistic identity, and but while at the same time being married and being a mother, and so experiencing these different universes that for her were always a source of personal conflict. So from page 18 on, we have some more examples of these cells. And in the context of the exercise that you have to do, you can see that many of these installations from Louise Bourgeois, especially the cells, that they have, they stage situations, and they often incorporate objects from daily life to construct a narrative. So in the case of your exercise, this can be interesting for you. And they can also be seen in many ways as still lives. We often don't have the direct presence of the human figure, but sometimes we have allusions to the human figure, although distorted, and the incorporation of objects from daily life, which are presented in a context which seems familiar, but at the same time isn't. So again, this idea of ambiguity. And for example, in Cell, we see that these figures, again, who are suspended with a hook, so often we see that these figures are presented suspended, and we see these hooks. So there is often these ideas of restriction, of a lack of freedom, that the characters or the human bodies who are somehow trapped in these cages or trapped in these situations, that somehow they sustain situations and they are not able to liberate themselves. And this is, of course, very confrontational for the viewer. We have on page 20 also a piece called Couple. And in this piece we have something like a marble box, a heavy white marble box that resembles a little bit a box of tissues, and that makes us think about tears and eventually about pain, or also like a Kleenex or something like that. We can also associate, for example, to things that people might use to clean the house, or etc. So objects that often are associated to women. And in this case, she really wants to break also this idea of bringing this object out of context and putting in the middle, so in this opening of this box, what looks like a box, a couple, a figure which is sewn together, somehow fused together in very flashy colors, giving a sense of warmth, of vulnerability, also in direct contrast to the coldness of this hard marble box. So again, it's a figure with a lot of piece with a lot of emotion and with a lot of suggestion of ambiguous feelings. On page 21, we have another piece that directly deals also with a female human body, so femme couteau, and we have a figure which is headless. She doesn't have a head, so it's a body without a head, which is marked somehow, and with so it has these red stripes, and there's these saws or these cutting elements, and this, of course, is an allusion to the potential violence against the female human body, and we can interpret many things here. We can interpret this as an allusion, for example, to plastic surgery, or to often things that women experience as negative feelings towards their body. I mean, this figure is also lacking arms, interestingly enough, so she doesn't have arms and she doesn't have a head. So somehow there is definitely the illusion that this female body, this figure has been somehow crippled or disabled by an exterior force. On page 22 we have another example of the cells, and this also has to do with the ideas on domesticity, and we have a kind of 50s looking allusion to a kind of 50s looking environment, where we have two illusions of two female figures, also without arms and legs and heads, so they are not people anymore, they're just figures. So they are not really humanized, or they don't really have an identity. but they have a presence to the dress that they wear, and we have these two competing female figures, and the subtitle of this cell is "The View of the World of the Jealous Wife." So there is this illusion of someone who would be the wife at home, and potentially sensing threats to this caged environment by the presence of another female figure. Page 23, we have another example on the cells, and we have this installation made with doors, and so a composite of objets trouvés, and then we see two spheres that we could define as two spheres of existence, very, very close together in this very tight space. So again, we are dealing with this, with these feelings of potential claustrophobia, with the conflict between the identity of the individual and the situation of being in a relationship, and also this feeling of closeness. On page 24, we have another example of a cell, and this was also a recurrent motive. That's also a sort of exorcism from experiences of Louise Bourgeois' childhood. And in this case, we have this illusion of a body with a spiral, and the topic of the spiral was something that she used very often in her work. And this idea of the spiral is also a form of exorcism that Louise Bourgeois performed. And it is an allusion to the mistress of her father, who happened to be her tutor. So it was an experience of double betrayal, that Louise Bourgeois knew that her father was having an affair with her own tutor in their own home. So she created also this figure with the spiral, and the spiral is an expression of this gesture she wanted to do to pick up the body of this woman, of this threatening agent, and twisting it over and over and over again. So similarly to this exorcism piece that she did for the destruction of the father, this idea of the woman with the body of the spiral also has this expression of the violence she wanted to express, of wanting to twist this woman's neck, and then to twist her body to kill her, to destroy her, and to and also somehow suspend her and present this as evidence of some form of justice. Also, so we have another example on page 25 of the cells, where we have this again this conflict between the hard cells, which are made of metal and these really cold and harsh materials, and then very fleshy materials, and also often Louise Bourgeois, especially in her later work in installations, she started to incorporate spheres and mirrors, which would bring also these ideas of distortion, of how the idea of multiple perceptions of the same situation, but also of distorted perception. And this was particularly effective in pieces that dealt with allusions to the body itself. And normally in her work, bodies are always presented in situations of vulnerability, of fragility, and these distortions created by the spheres and by the mirrors accentuate also, and also bring ideas on representation, on self-perception, and so on. Another really important piece from Louise Bourgeois that directly deals with her interest in Freudian archetypes is called The Arch of Hysteria. And in this case, we have a male figure which is suspended and doing this hysterical arch. The hysterical arch was something that was reported, especially in the beginnings of psychology and psychiatry, and it was something that was described. Hysteria was supposedly scientific way to describe states of extreme emotional distress that were often attributed to women. And Freud had the theory that often these situations happened when women had experienced prolonged periods of personal and sexual repression. And so this would manifest itself in these hysterical states, and often in the body contorting itself by doing this hysterical arch. Of course, this was also a stereotype, and nowadays we know from psychiatry that this was misleadingly attributed to women's problems, although of course many women experienced very strong repressions, and particularly sexual repression. And this, of course, manifested itself in neurosis and psychological and physical problems. But it was not a problem exclusive to women. And at the same time, Louise Bourgeois, by having a male figure which looks very slim and delicate and also suspended, performing this hysterical arch, she also subverts the expectations that only women are vulnerable or subjected to being in situations of fragility and vulnerability, and she brings it to the whole human condition. And just ending now with Louise Bourgeois. So we have here on page 27 a picture of her near her studio in Manhattan, with a costume she created with these bubbly, flashy with an object that creates this kind of textures and surfaces that looks somehow uncanny, as I mentioned before, but also human, or dealing with aspects of the human that we often tend to prefer not to see, or that women often are discouraged or forbidden to show. So here, for example, this costume, we could think that it looks almost like large-scale bumps or lumps of fat or of meat, and so Louise Bourgeois very provocatively wears it as a costume and as her whole body outside, not inside but outside. So now I will discuss a little bit the work of other feminist artists. Not in so much detail, because otherwise this lecture will be too long. But just giving an overview, I think it's important to give context on the work of Louise Bourgeois, because we really understand that from then on, more other female artists really wanted to explore such topics that directly dealt with women's situation in the world. So another artist I want to talk about is Miriam Shapiro, who quoted, "I wanted to validate the traditional activities of women, to connect myself with the unknown women artists who made quilts, who had done the invisible women's work of civilization. I wanted to acknowledge them, to honor them." So Miriam Shapiro, she was studying art and developing her practice when she was still, and this was in the United States, and she was influenced or she was developing in this context when abstract expressionism and minimalism were considered very important and high art, and but although these styles were also performed by male. It was a very male-dominated environment. So Miriam Shapiro wanted to create her own artistic identity by expanding her materials to include this idea, as I mentioned before, of incorporating what was previously considered domestic crafts, and also to work with feminist imagery. So she was very interested she was also an activist, and she worked with another artist, which I will mention next, Judy Chicago, and they were very interested in recovering the work and histories and reputation of other women artists in history who they considered were forgotten or neglected or nobody talked about. So she also worked with in her work. She also explored autobiographical details, on not hiding her personal history but making it part of the work. And she also directly addressed through her work her personal and professional struggles and conflicts due to the fact of being a woman. So on page 29 we have an example of a painting from Marian Shapira, Shrine for Two Paint Tubes, and this is something that we see could have some connections to surrealism, and it's also still live in many ways. But we see this figure of the egg, which of course in this case is a direct allusion to ideas on creation and fertility. Marian Shapiro was also very innovative because she was one of the first artists, and not just female artists, to explore new technologies in her work. So she was very interested in computation, and so she worked with ideas from computation to create artworks which were done with the use of such technologies. So she was not only interested in craft but also in this kind of technological advancements, but directly exploring things which we could say are directly female topics or female imagery. So, for example, in Miriam Shapiro's Big Ox, which we have on page 30, we could say that there is something here that reminds us of op art with the way she uses color. So there is definitely this kind of very strong perceptual play. But what she's presenting here is also something that is a direct reference to the female genitals, so to a vagina, although in an abstracted form. Another piece from Miriam Shapiro, this one from 1972, which is called Dollhouse, and this is a hybrid between assemblage and installation, and it's this idea of very similar to some of the early pieces of those Louise Bourgeois that you also saw in the previous slides. So we have this house, this domestic setting, but it's also not just a house, it's a dollhouse. So again, this illusion of the domestic environment, potentially the place of the female or the realm of the female, and it's called a dollhouse, so where the dolls would be. But interestingly enough, when looking closely at the images from the dollhouse, we see that each one of these rooms in the house is not necessarily an absolute place for oppression. It's also a place for self-expression, where after all these shut down layers of the outside world, we see a little bit of the interior world of the characters that live in there. And we also see some allusion through objects and symbols to things that directly refer to the lives of women. So, for example, we have in one of these rooms we have a Persian carpet, and this is definitely a reference to the craft of weaving, which was women's work. And we have references to the embroidery curtains and also there's a spider, a big spider in one of the rooms. So all these symbols and icons of what is normally attributed to the female. Another important piece from Miriam Shapiro is called Mother Russia. And this is a very interesting piece, in which Miriam Shapiro tries to combine her Russian heritage and also bring it as part of the work. And it's an interesting mix between traditional ideas of what Russian was, or her historical heritage as someone who had Russian ancestry, but also combine it with some of the icons of what Russia became, and also in a way that so, for example, it's presented. The presentation of the work is used in a fan, so it's also an object which is normally associated only with women and with womanhood. So again, very consistent in this idea of relating to the female. So an artist that worked together with Miriam Shapiro in this idea of creating also an environment and a kind of institution that would preserve and support women artists' work was Judy Chicago. So the project that Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago developed together was called Woman House, and this was a feminist art program which was founded in the 70s at the Cal State Fresno, and it was meant as an installation and performance space for women. So it was a house that was abandoned, and this group of women renovated it, and it was women's exclusive. They renovated the house, renovated the building, and created a space where they could develop their work and also work with media they were interested in. So installation and performance were the most manifestations that they were interested in, and the whole idea was also to encourage other female artists to work to emancipate themselves from what they perceived was still, so to say, a guys' club in the art world. In a more contemporary citation, Judy Chicago mentioned that I believe in art that is connected to real human feeling, that extends itself beyond the limits of the art world to embrace all people who are striving for alternatives in an increasingly dehumanized world. I am trying to make art that relates to the deepest and most mythic concerns of humankind, and I believe that at this moment of history, feminism is humanism. So it's also interesting to see how, although Judy Chicago definitely is a feminist artist and still is a feminist artist in her work, she addresses the topic of feminist not as exclusively female, but as something that has implications in the whole society, also for the male, so for the human in general. Most important piece by Judy Chicago is The Dinner Party, which was started in 1974 and developed through 1979. And this is an installation, and it was in a way also kind of social sculpture. It was done by a large group of women who worked for, as you can see, many years, 5 years, to develop this project, using a mix, an installation that uses a mix of embroidery and pottery and so. And it's definitely an icon of 20th century art. And it's one of the most significant and recognized pieces of feminist art. So many things that are important about this work is, as I mentioned, the collaborative working process, and also the political symbolism and the scale. So it's a large-scale piece that basically creates a situation where all the participants of this dinner party are female figures from mythology, but also other female figures that had historical or mythological reverence. And so this is a situation that directly pays homage to these women to make sure that they would not be forgotten, but also creating through this triangle, also female symbol, a feeling of unity and a feeling of being together, to surpass this suppression of the patriarchal society. And at the same time, by the techniques that were used to create the piece, it's also a celebration of the traditional feminine crafts. So textile crafts, weaving, embroidering, sewing, and ceramic decoration. Another piece by Judith Chicago, in this case a painting. She was also a very accomplished painting, and in her painting style she was very interested in exploring bright psychedelic color arrangements. She had some experiences with psychedelics in the 60s and the 70s, and this somehow influenced her painting. And in this, on page 42, we have this example, Driving the World to Destruction, from 1985, where we have this very exaggerated male figure, a symbol of brute strength, of brute force, basically crippling the world through an overdrive of male ego. So it's a very direct piece, and it has, in some ways, it appropriates the language of one could say of propaganda, but it's also purposefully meant as a kind of ironic commentary on this kind of attitude. So another feminist artist that is relevant in this context is Barbara Kruger. We already mentioned Barbara Kruger in the context of conceptual art. So you saw the work I Shop, Therefore I Am. So Barbara Kruger worked with conceptual art, and she was very interested in the topic of language, and she was very interested in appropriating. In many ways, her work also has some parallels with Duchamp or Dada in some ways, that she appropriated language from the media, specifically magazines, which were at the time also something considered women's reading, so to say, so inferior, not so important, not really books or newspapers, but magazines. And so she was interested in picking up these stereotypes from the magazines, and but also with a kind of color scheme, the black and white and red, which also makes us think about propaganda, and using language and image together to create these very subversive messages. So, for example, here on page 44, we have an Untitled, which says, "You invest in the divinity of the masterpiece." So it's a reference to the Michelangelo Sistine Chapel fragment of the creation of man with the finger touching each other, and in this case, what Barbara Kruger wants to tell to the viewer is that it is the person who views the artwork who has the decision on the value of the work also. So it is an exchange that happens. It's not the work which is divine in itself, but there is a transference that happens, a communication that happens between the viewer and the artwork. So this is also very subversive in the sense that it kind of questions the role of art, and it questions the value of art by, in many ways, transferring the power of the work to the viewer. Another very important piece, and in this case definitely feminist, of Barbara Kruger is called "Your Body is a Battleground," and so we have here this, on one side, this idealized image, female image from advertising that looks absolutely perfect and flawless, and on the other side we have negative of this image, and we have this suggestive "Your body is a battleground," which pushes women or suggests women to take ownership of their own bodies and not be passive or compliant subjects to the expectations of media, to the expectations of commodification, of being expected to buy all sorts of products to make themselves flawless and beautiful all the time, and completely losing touch with their own with one's own sense of self and one's own sense of body. So this idea of reclaiming the body as a battleground for what is of oneself. Another example from Barbara Kruger is that you have on page 46. It's an large-scale installation in which Barbara Kruger is also working with language and with these large-scale images, and in this case, it's dealing with the idea of violence. And how violence is often something that happens as a consequence of intolerance and the imposition of stereotypes. So that when a woman or an individual in society does not comply with specific stereotypes, which can be imposed by the context, the intolerance that might appear might express itself as forms of violence and forms of oppression. So she uses this suggestive language. For example, you pledge as something that an individual can do to comply and to go and to follow along with something that might not be according to how one feels and how one wants to be in the world. Another artist that, of course, we have to mention in the context of feminist art, although this can be, and it is always when we talk about the work of Marina Abramovich, a little bit controversial, but this is also one of the aspects that makes her work so relevant. Piece that I have selected here to discuss from Marina Abramovich's Rhythm Zero from 1974. And I've chosen this piece to discuss Abramovich's work since it also deals in some components with this topic of the still life. So she prepared a performance which has a tableau where she displays objects of everyday life, some which are made to create pleasure and others which are made to inflict pain. And the whole concept of the performance was that the 72 objects which were laying there could be used by the audience on her. And she would stay in the performance, and she did for 6 hours, being an object. That was her statement. It was written as the instruction of the performance. I am an object, and during this period I take full responsibility. But what happened was that during those 6 hours, in fact, the performance, the actions of the participants became increasingly violent. So she never reacted to any of the actions which were done. So at some point, some people cut her or did actions which were threatening. And then, of course, the audience reacted in different ways. Some people tried to protect her, other people got more and more excited, and in the end, the performance was ended. Of course, we can discuss and we can say that she placed herself in the situation, and this is true. But as often Abramovich has discussed about the work was more about showing what people can do when they see someone in a state of vulnerability, and it's also about boundaries. Um, but this also has to do with Marina Abramovich's practice and her own very personal belief in her work that confronting physical pain and exhaustion is an important part of making someone completely present and aware of his or herself. So, in the context of Marina Abramovich and her work, anyone who can read her memories knows that she also experienced a traumatic childhood with a lot of situations of physical and psychological abuse. Um, Both her parents were partisans in the communist regime, so there was a lot of military discipline and many protocols and taboos. So Marina Abramovich deals with this kind of work in many ways to test her own limits, but also to exercise some of these very difficult feelings that she experienced. But in this case, it was also as a way to, regarding the audience, she wanted the spectators to be not just passive observers, but collaborators in the process. So it was a participatory performance, and it was also proving a point about choice, that given the choice and the possibility of hurting another human being, there might be people who might choose to hurt. So it's more revealing also, it's revealing about what the audience can do. And that was her conclusion at the end of the performance, and often Abramovich discusses in retrospect this performance, that if one would allow, as an artist, and especially a performance artist, the audience can kill you. And this is definitely also something that we can read in a feminist context, that about boundaries and about how women often allow themselves to be the object of mistreatment, and if not careful or if too permissive, successive boundaries can be more and more crossed to the point of harm and eventually to the point of death. Another artist which we can definitely categorize as dealing with feminist topics or feminist art is Paula Havel, who was born in Portugal but lives in England since a long time, but she still deals with a lot of her Portuguese cultural background. I am very familiar also with the work of Paula Havel, since I'm also Portuguese myself. Paula Havel's work really deals with a lot of the consequences of having grown up in a family and in a country which experienced a dictatorship for 50 years, and in which women were given almost no agency in their lives. Most lived very suppressed in domestic environments with a lot of labor, very little possibility of agency and of choice on the development of their own lives, and often also experiencing very difficult situations of oppression and potentially abuse. So a very known and also polemic series from Paula Havel was dedicated to the topic of abortion. And this was a very polemic series. It was done in the context of voting that happened in Portugal to decide to legalize or not abortion. And Paula Havel made very graphic depictions of situations of women that went to this that asked to have an abortion, and these were experiences she shared with women while she was growing up. So these were our paintings that represent women who made a choice about their bodies, and which is of course a difficult personal choice, but which, due to the conditions namely the conditions in Portugal, did not have the medical support to do so, to perform an abortion, and would have to do it in really unhygienic, dangerous conditions. And the paintings show the situation that often the conditions and the suffering that these women often went through, but also, and that's why the paintings are polemic, they show that these are women who made a choice. So although they go through these conditions, they made a decision. And of course, this is a polemic topic, but it brings awareness to a situation that was not dealt and was not openly discussed specifically in Portugal, still in the 90s. So the abortion panels are from 1998. Other paintings from Paula Havel, for example, very important are her paintings of dog women. Her first drawing of the dog woman is from 1952, and she continues with this series. And her idea of the dog women is not a woman who is necessarily destroyed or downtrodden or submitted. Paula Havel explains that in these pictures, every woman is a dog woman, not destroyed but powerful, because she's acting as a beast, and in this case to act like a beast is a good thing. Eating, snarling, all activities to do with sensation as positive. To picture a woman as a dog is utterly believable. So this is also a very subversive gesture that breaks these ideas of the feminine as someone who is constantly polite and proper and doing what is expected, but also someone who can be angry, who can be menacing, who can be acting like an animal, or in this case a dangerous animal. And it's also a representation of often the justified anger that many women feel. We also have on page 55. So Paula Havel works a lot with storytelling. So in the context of your Aufgabe with the still life, and now at the later stages also with this kind of Inszenierung or staging or representation using the body. She works with storytelling, so she incorporates a lot of props. The characters are often characters that she also picks up memories, sometimes from her own childhood, but she works a lot with fairy tales and other stories to create stories through her paintings. And of course the costume and the objects that the characters use and how they are performing these stories is very important to convey the narrative. So also an interesting example we have here on page 55 from Paula Havel is an angel, also from 1998. And this is a very interesting, also strong female character who carries on one hand a sword and on the other hand a sponge. So sponge we associate with cleaning, but we can also see in combination with the sword there is a feeling of justice, and there is a feeling also of defiance in the whole gesture and in the whole face of this angel. So it's also a figure that reveals a lot about triumph, about removing that which is which needs to be taken away, but to be cleaned, but also a reference to this ambivalence between the tasks normally associated with women, so the cleaning, and the sword, which can stand for fighting, but also for intellectual sharpness and achievement. So it is definitely also a symbol of empowerment. So we could continue talking about feminist art for a long time. And in this cycle of lectures and also in this channel, I tried, as you probably saw in the other lectures, I tried to include also as many female artists as possible. But of course, it's not an exclusively dedicated to feminists. So we will also talk about other other artists and other art movements from now on. Although we will include in a few minutes also the work of Cindy Sherman, who can also be categorized as a feminist artist. So we are over with feminist art, but not completely over yet. And we will still talk about Marina Abramovich again. So now we were talking about Paula Havel, and I showed some examples from the 90s, but we will go a little bit back in time again to the end 70s, and we will talk about another movement which appeared mostly in the United States, which is photorealism, also known as hyperrealism or superrealism. And this was developed by a group of painters. It comes from painting, American painters and sculptors also, that were reacting to post-war art, pop culture and photography. So some of these artists, for example, Chuck Close, who we will have as example, and also Richard Estes, they were influenced by pop art, and they wanted to bring again this idea of working with very sharp images and very precise representation and craftsmanship, so being able to produce images which really were sharp and were photorealistic, and they were not interested in automatism or improvisation. So in a way one can say that it could be also a reaction to abstract expressionism and informalism and all these manifestations that were much more interested with exploring automatic gestures and more emotional representations. Photorealism was interested in the clear image and the photorealistic image. So we have here an example on page 57 of Chuck Close, the big self-portrait, which is a large-scale painting, a hyperrealistic painting in which he presents himself smoking a cigarette. So there's also a kind of gesture of defiance in the way he presents himself. And we have other examples of this photorealistic approach that Chuck Close developed mostly with portraits, through portraits. We have another self-portrait from 1997 in which he had developed a little bit away from this very crisp photorealistic representation, and he uses painting and this kind of pixelated look with a play of geometry and color to create an image. So this is also playing with our ideas on perception, and it's also, this painting is from 1997, so of course there is already here an influence of some new media in painting, so how an image can be pixelated and translated through color and then recreated again through the medium of painting. So there is definitely in photorealism a very strong influence of photography. Richard Estes' Telephone Booth. So this is a painting also, and it's a photorealistic painting. Richard Estes was influenced by the paintings of Edward Hopper, who we did not mention here, but he was also a very important American painter, especially in the 50s. And Richard Estes was also interested in bringing back this tradition of hyperrealistic representation in painting, also when this using subject matter that is from daily life. So in this case, it's also important in the context of the still life. And we have here on page 61 an example, which is a painting which shows phone booths and people talking at phone booths. We don't really see the characters or the faces of these characters, and we almost don't see the characters. We are very, our perception is very much occupied with these telephone booths and all the reflections that come from the telephone booths. Another example it's from another artist, Ralph Goings, and this is Two Waitresses Afternoon Break, which is a painting, and it really looks like a photograph, and it's a very sharp, crisp image that shows also a daily common scene of what we could see, a scene from daily life in the United States, a very stereotypical, one could almost say archetypal depiction of life in America. Also from Ralph Goins, we have here two still lifes, which also pick up this idea of the mundane objects. And we have here, for example, the Heinz tomato ketchup next to salt and pepper, and the paper towels dispenser, or a close-up of two shakers. And these are still lives which really look like crisp photographs, almost from advertisement. And in this way, they are photorealism was definitely influenced by pop art, but applied or manifested through the medium of painting. And now we are still at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, and we arrive at something which is called the pictures generation. And here in the pictures generation, we can include the work of different artists. For example, I will discuss the work of Cindy Sherman, Barbara Kruger, who I mentioned in the context of feminist art and conceptual art, is also someone who can be included in the pictures generation, but also Richard Prince, who we will not talk about today, but I encourage you to look for his work. So the work of these artists of the picture generation, we can say that they are included in this idea of the pictures generation because they were influenced by advertising, television, and the increasing growth of the mass media, which was basically led by the image. So the idea of these artists was to explore these contemporary images in photos and video also, and to appropriate this representation from everyday media to create artwork. And of course, the pictures generation, and we see this, for example, a lot in the work of Cindy Sherman and also Barbara Kruger, they also, because there is this question about what is the relationship between the original media, so in some way we could say that there's also reference in Dada, that it picks up these images which were fabricated for consumption and have been reproduced, and uses them or appropriates them to create the work. So of course there is a big question here, which is the question of authorship. Who creates this image? And where does the authorship of this image end and become another image or something else? While perhaps still being recognizable from where it comes from. So in the case of the work of Barbara Kruger, when we see the reference to the work of Michelangelo, that reference is there and it's an obvious reference, but since this image is appropriated and put in a different context, the authorship here is the relationship on what is authentic and what is a fake or what is a reproduction also is open to question or to debate. So I will talk more extensively about the work of Cindy Sherman. Cindy Sherman is recognized as one of the most important and influential artists in contemporary art. She creates photographs, and she works with her own body as a model, and she stages all these in photographs herself. So she creates characters and stages these situations with the characters, and she creates these disguises and personas, and creates images which confront us with a lot of ideas and expectations we have, of course, on roles of women. But she doesn't perform in her stagings only as women. She has also taken male characters and all sorts of different characters. So she always works with series, And for example, she has a series which is not included here in the images I gave you, dedicated to pirates, for example, where she performs in a situation as a pirate. She has series dedicated to Hollywood aging divas, another series dedicated to clowns, other series dedicated to the exploration of the film noir. But in her, we see that her characters, she's a very poignant, piercing observer of humans, and of how, especially how humans present themselves, and she's exploring through her work how identities are constructed and how these presentations and personas we adopt in the world are also forms of fabrication, and that they are forms of fabrication that can be come more or less from a personal sense of agency, but also through external influences. So there are a lot of stereotypes, and we can definitely recognize these stereotypes in her work. And there's many ambivalent ideas. There's the images can trigger discuss ideas on beauty, but also on the grotesque. And each picture and each character really tells a story, and we can read each one of these characters, which are always present often in an overly theatrical or exaggerated way, but they somehow remind us, although there is a strong level of exaggeration, they always somehow remind us of people that we know or people that we have met. And they often also remind us of aspects of ourselves, and how often also the identity and the sense of oneself is not necessarily bound to just one persona, but it can manifest itself in different aspects. So Cindy Sherman has also, she works with, she appropriates also iconography and ideas from classical art. So she also has series dedicating to the recreation of classical paintings. There's one series in which she's directly quoting ideas from Renaissance painting. So when she really recreates the kind of the light, the costume, the gesture, and everything, but always putting it with these different, with these layers of also of ambiguity and of thought of what narratives exactly can be transmitted through these images. A very interesting aspect in her work is that she's very interested in imperfection, although the images always look very crisp. She's interested in imperfection, and she's also interested in it's a one-woman show. So she is her own model, she is her own makeup artist, her own costume designer, hairdresser, photographer. So she takes all these different roles while preparing and doing the work. And in this way, she also works very systematically, since she works in series. So there's also definitely an aspect of using her own body as a medium to channel these emotions and to create the narratives. And so you can see from all the pictures that it's always Cindy Sherman performing these different roles, creating the images. More recently, she released her Instagram account, where we see that she is playing with the filters of Instagram, and this is very interesting because it also opens a kind of polemic discussion in the art world, that from the moment that the artist freely distributes the work online for anyone to see, so this is also, it can also be seen subversive, but in many ways it's completely consistent with what she has been doing and what was the attitude of the pictures generation, which is exactly to appropriate these things from the mainstream and the mainstream modes of communication, which influence the fabrication of ideas and the fabrication of the presentation and the persona, and directly use this and appropriate this to create the work. So now she's working with Instagram and with the filters of Instagram to create these really otherworldly characters. Often, what's also really interesting about Cindy Sherman's work and how she questions notions of beauty is that often she's not wearing or using costume and makeup and hair in this way that normally advertising and so proposes women as a kind of form of compliance to make women comply to certain beauty standards, but she appropriates exactly these strategies to question these ideas. And we definitely see it in her Instagram series, how she's picking up these ideas on Instagram beauty and completely transforming and distorting them to create something else and to deconstruct these ideas on new ideals of beauty. So I am really sure that Cindy Sherman watched a lot of tutorials and is very aware of the protocols of presentation on YouTube and Instagram and all these forms of beauty, and she's deconstructing them to create these new images. And so there's here a very fine selection, and it's also available. So she made these images public online. And now, well, actually, this is a little bit now not out of context, but I should have aligned them with feminist art and not with the pictures generation. But anyway, I will mention them in this context anyway, because of course we are again discussing topics which have to do with feminist art. So Cindy Sherman in this way is of course also a feminist artist. So another example of feminist art that I would like to mention, although I should have mentioned it before, but now I mention it after Cindy Sherman, because they are contemporary, also working contemporary, are Pussy Riot. And Pussy Riot, they are a group of Russian artists, activists that also question these ideas on the roles of women in society, and they do it as a form of political activism. And they also use social media and YouTube, and I made this connection with Cindy Sherman because of Instagram, to make forms of political protest. So they have been persecuted and punished also for some of their actions, and you have here some examples. And similarly to Cindy Sherman, they also pick up these stereotypes of the clothing and of usual female representation, and use it in very subversive ways. So using very strong colors and skirts, and also the baklavas with different colors. So they are also very influenced by another group of feminist artists from the 60s and 70s, the guerrilla girls, and so they have also this spirit of guerrilla to fight for women's rights, and also specifically in the context of Russia, as a form of political activism. So this was just a short notice. I should have mentioned Pussy Riot in the context of feminist art, but we can still mention it now. So we were discussing the new pictures generation. Now we will talk about another movement, which is Neo-Expressionism. And Neo-Expressionism started around the 80s. And I won't talk too long about it, but it's especially important in this context because, besides being, of course, a relevant art movement, it's an opportunity to mention the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was a black artist who worked in the United States. At some point, he was very closely also collaborating with Andy Warhol, and he emerged from the punk scene in New York City, and he was very influenced and working as a graffiti artist, and he became relevant because he was probably one of the first black artists to make this transition from the street or naive art to be celebrated as someone who is presented in an international art gallery circuit. He died very young of overdose, and some critics also mentioned that he became a kind of a symbol of something that starts originally and then becomes too fast and too quickly commodified and commercialized, but he became successful. So his painting is specifically relevant because he combined this street style with and developed a very specific and personal imagery. So he worked a lot with this theme of the vanitas, so frequently reference to the skull. And he developed his own system of signs. So there is definitely references to graffiti and to this kind of spontaneous, also more automatic way of painting and representation. But also what's relevant in the work of Basquiat is really the creation of his own personal symbols and language of visual representation. And we have here some examples where this is clearly visible. And we see not just the influence of graffiti, but also from his life as an urban dweller, but also some references to his heritage as an African Caribbean. So in some ways, what was also interesting about Basquiat's work was that in the 80s, after a lot of time dedicated to, in the United States, to minimalism and conceptual art, Basquiat brings again the human figure to the space of representation, and creates a dialogue again with some of the ideas and the concept of abstract expressionism. So by bringing up again this idea of the impulse and of the automatism, and of also working with more expressive ways of representation and the themes of representation, while exploring a deeply personal universe. It also has some connections, of course, to informal art that we mentioned some lessons ago. And with because in many ways he also explored this idea of not really following a canon of representation, but really working with a very personal visual universe. Another artist that is relevant to mention in the context of Neo-Expressionism is Francesco Clemente, who is an Italian-American artist, and he's one of the most important representatives of the postmodern Italian trans avant-garde. So the works of Francesco Clemente have changed a lot over time. In some ways, similarly to Basquiat, he was very interested in exploring a personal universe and a kind of personal narrative through painting, and he was also interested in questions of identity. So his work is a very peculiar mix of interests, his own personal interests in esoteric subjects. So he lives partially in India, New York, and Italy. And through his work, there were many different phases. There were phases where he was more interested in addressing topics of gender, topics of identity. At other times, he was more interested in portraits or representation of. He made many relevant portraits of the New York art scene, especially in the 80s. But he was also influenced by different figures. For example, he was for some time, I don't want to tell you the wrong information. Exactly, he in 1974, for example, he was in Germany, and he was for some time under the influence of Joseph Beuys, who was an art professor. So in this way, I think that he was probably also influenced by Beuys's ideas on working with some components of informalism. Although Clemente didn't really work conceptually in this sense, but his later work also includes installations. So you have in page 94 and page 95 two examples of installations of tints, where he creates this kind of personal universe of symbols. And here we can see some connections of Neo-Expressionism with Basquiat. So it's really a very peculiar mix that we could say with surrealism, esoteric subjects, which was also something that concerned the surrealists, but in a very personal creation of a very personal visual language. And now we arrive at, we will move away from New York, where we talked, we can say that Neo-Expressionism is mostly concerned with the work of these artists who were working in New York. So in this case, we mentioned the work of Basquiat and also of Clemente. And now we will go to the 90s and discuss the work of young British artists. So this was also not very tight group, so it was a kind of group of painters, sculptors, installation and video artists that met while studying at the fine art at the London's Goldsmiths College. And what unified or brought together also these artists were that they were interested in using shock and very direct confrontational approaches to make a point and to get the attention of the audience. So the two artists we will discuss in this context are Damien Hirst and Tracey Emin. But before we go into the work of Damien Hirst and Tracey Emin, because we are talking about England, I also want to mention, although they are not in this category of young British artists, I want to mention the work also of Gilbert and George, who is an artists duo. They work together as a team, and they are also a live couple, and they are openly homosexual. And they work since the 70s in this mix of performance art and different media. So also painting, and more recently working a lot with digital media. So Gilbert and George are openly provocative, and that's why I mentioned them before young British artists, because I find that in many ways they open the door to this kind of artistic manifestation, since they are working already for over 50 years, but they make this kind of work which is deliberately provocative and wants to grab the attention of the audience. So they often use swear words or socially forbidden words, eventually even bodily fluids. And they really want to expose and to confront the audience very provocatively with difficult subjects such as religion, power, death, the monarchy, patriotism, identity, sexuality, and they like to put all these things together in often in one image or in sequences of images. So they're not necessarily interested in creating beautiful images, and they want these images to be subversive, to confront and provoke the audience, but also to be open to everyone. They both have humble background, so they do not believe in an elitistic approach to art, or art that is accessible only for a few. They want to make art that is accessible to all, while at the same time they're openly monarchic and conservative. And they say, it's their own statement, that the art world is dominated by left-wing intelligentsia, and they state that they want to represent another side, and that this side is also legitimate in art. Of course, this is also one of their provocative statements, but it is their position. Often what happens in their work, and this is also programmatic in what they do, they want to break religious and dogmatic religious dogmas through their art. So they directly provoke by using iconography from religion. And they also want to break taboos by working with what is openly politically incorrect. So there is a lot of humor in their images. Often the images are on purpose not beautiful. They are made to shock and to provoke. So it's not everybody's cup of tea, as one would say probably in England, but they are nonetheless relevant. And this is an attitude or a way of presenting their artwork, which in many ways, in my opinion, opened the way also for the artwork of young British artists. So you have some examples of a selection of the work of Gilbert and George, and how in some ways also there are some connections with the pictures generation, since you see that there is clearly the appropriation from the photographic montage with the photographic imagery and icons and for example the British flag, and these images are put together in these composites. And of course there's also references to a certain cheapness and immediacy of advertising and of the tabloids, and this is used on purpose as part of their aesthetic. So now I will talk a little bit about the work of Damien Hirst, who is also an absolute showman, and who definitely uses to his advantage since this beginning of his career. He became successful very fast and had the support of Charles Saatchi, who gave him unlimited resources from almost the beginning of his career. And he became probably one of the most successful, commercially successful artists, and still is really shaping how the art market works by creating more and more outrageous pieces. And of course this can be definitely discussed, but it's also part of his program. So it's a very controversial figure, but it's nonetheless relevant, so it has to be included also in this discussion. Paradoxically enough, in the context of our exercise that we have for the still life, Damien Hirst, he's fascinated with the topic of life and death, specifically death, and he often incorporated in his work taxidermied animals, so animals which were preserved in fluid or pinned, in the case of butterflies, for example, pinned in a canvas. And so he also had some installations with rotting components of animals or even with alive creatures. So that was an installation with live butterflies, and the installation, in the installation one could follow the life cycle of the butterfly and see the butterfly die and the corpse of the butterfly. So this is definitely part of his work. But in some ways, one can say that controversial as it is, the approach of Hearst picks up a lot of historical tradition, specifically this idea of the still life and of the memento mori, since he is also picking up a lot of iconography from these classical images. So this interest in biology and also in the fragility of life and of the human body is also explored in some of his works, where he incorporates the aesthetic from medical contexts, and also this universe of morbidity, which is made in confrontation with bodies of animals very, very often. So we have here some examples where you can see, and also a very famous Memento Mori by, or Vanitas by Damien Hirst, For the Love of God. His work, of course, deals a lot with humor and with picking up also ideas from and representations from religion and subverting them. Another artist that we can mention in this context of young British artists, and we can also say that in some ways what she does can also be seen as feminist art, is Tracey Emin. So she's also a polemic figure, like most of these young British artists. And what was polemic about her work was that she was one of the first British female artists, or artists in general, to break notions of femininity by addressing her own personal trauma, and by showing, making her own life visible as part of the work. So she herself as a work of art. So she also went through traumatic experiences. She experienced a situation of rape when she was very young, and she addresses topics in her work such as public humiliation, sexism, abortion, alcoholism, promiscuity, and she puts these things, so to say, as on display as her work, and how she self-maps or takes track of her process as a human and as a woman, and she uses this often the self-portrait and performance, but also in some cases installation, to make these confessionals. So it's also confessional art, and here we see some connections also to the work of Marina Abramovich. And for her, this confessional aspect is used as a form of catharsis and exploring the healing and spiritual aspect of art, of the art practice. So what's also interesting about the work of Tracey Emin is that she's openly vulnerable and honest through her art. And she breaks these stereotypes of the polite and modest English woman by really showing her dirty laundry in public, so to say. Of course, she became successful also very young, and she was often very exposed by the British gossip magazines and so on, but in many ways she also incorporated this as part of the work. So we have some examples from the work of Tracey Emin. So from 1995, the tent Everyone I Have Ever Slept With, in which she also uses embroidery and this kind of very female, supposedly delicate female ways of expression and craft, but to expose a topic that would make many people um, perhaps uncomfortable, and we see the names of these people, and the names are very big, and there's men and there's women, so there's allusions to her own private, not allusions, but her private world, and her sexuality is also here openly exposed. Another relevant piece by Tracy Emin is called My Bed, and this is definitely, it's an installation, and it's definitely a still life. And it's a composite or an assemblage of the objects and the situation which was created through a bout of depression she experienced after a breakup. So it's a very honest piece where we see the traces of the actions of someone who experienced this kind of emotional suffering, and we see empty bottles of alcohol and cigarettes and trash and a neglected space. So for probably conservative British morals, some voices could say this is not how a lady acts, so, or very unladylike behavior. So this piece definitely breaks this kind of taboo and shows with all honesty situation and feelings of pain and of recovery from an emotionally difficult situation. And on page 114 we have another image of Tracy Emin, My Bed, with the artist next to the installation. So now we stop with young British artists, and as I had warned you before, this is a long lecture, but we are a little bit close to the end. So this is our final chapter, and this is dedicated to time-based art. And I use this definition here, time-based art, in a very wide scope. Time-based media is normally any kind of media that takes time to view or to be seen, so it incorporates an element of duration. Time-based media normally includes some kind of technological component, so it could be physical media such as film or video or digital, or it can also incorporate elements from video games, but it can also be incorporate performance, since it deals with time, or electronic art can also be incorporated in this wider scope of time-based art. But mostly it deals with the moving image. It's different from film, and it's different from commercial film or movies, we could say, the films we see in the movie theater, because first of all it's artistic, and it doesn't, normally time-based art is not really addressing storytelling in the way we are used to seeing in a film narrative, but it uses time in a much more, we could say, almost mindful way. And depending on the approach of the artists, for example, I will show you the work of Bill Viola and also later of Robert Wilson, who work with HD to produce very crisp images, often very, 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 very slow, almost like paintings. So time-based art really, but it depends on the artist. Some artists like to work with time-based art to explore the possibility of the medium of film also to extend time, so super slow motion or super slow movement, or using the possibility of going reversing time in the image, and so for the exploration of certain aesthetic effects, but also for depending on the development of the narrative. So it depends from artist to artist, but mostly it deals with time, and it deals with some kind of installation that involves a technological component. So video, normally it's installed as either in a gallery, in an installation context, but it could also be installed, for example, here on YouTube. So if you follow the corporeal architecture channel, you can see that the performances I install here, this is also a curatorial project. The channel is also meant to be an archive and an exhibition room for time-based media. So I consider these lessons as performances and also as time-based media. But this is an approach. So now I will discuss a little bit the work of Bill Viola, who is one of the most important and still contemporary American video and installation artists. So he was very important because he really made video a significant art form in contemporary art. So before there were some experimental approaches, but his approach to video really elevated video and time-based art as a legitimate art form in itself. Also through the creations of atmospheres. So his installations also involve other elements such as music and performance. So he's also interested in the creation of environments through these and experiences. The work is often characterized by very precise images, and he's interested also in topics of religion and mysticism, so he also picks up iconography and motives from religion and from mysticism. Sensory perception and the idea of being connected to sensory perception is also something that is very important in the work of Bill Viola. He had an experience very early in his life that he almost drowned, and he continuously refers to this experience as a transformative event. So it's also marked his work and his interest in the transition between life and death and these different states also of consciousness. And also as a way to use these experiences and the reflection on these experiences through the work as a path to self-knowledge. So his idea is that through the work the audience can experience also his own personal journey, while at the same time connecting with these universal topics of life and death and the transition between different things. So in some ways we can also see that although most of the work of Bill Viola incorporates the human figure, so it has to do also with figuration, that's how we call it in art history, there's many components that also pick up this tradition of the still life and also of staging and storytelling in classical painting, especially in his later, more recent work. So you have some examples, and I also leave you some links, because although you can see it in pictures, the work of Bill Viola really should be seen and experienced in video. And often these installations are, they're not just a video, the video is only one part of it, the whole environment, the sound and the light and the room and the setting, they're all part of this environment which is created to receive the work. And this is also a component of time-based media. So I definitely encourage you to see the videos, because the sound and the moving image is extremely important for the narrative and the feeling of what is transmitted with the work. Another artist, very complex, influential artist that I want to mention in this context of time-based art, because he also works with film as a way of storytelling, but he's also a visual artist, so he's an artist, director, and filmmaker, and incorporates different media, drawing, sculpture, also working with architecture. and this is American artist Matthew Barney, who is one of the most influential contemporary American art media artists. Um, so his most famous work, or the work that brought him to attention and celebrity, is the Cremaster Cycle, which is a 5-part film created through a period of 8 years, in which Matthew Barney develops his own creation myth and a very idiosyncratic narrative, which mixes a universe, a kind of surrealist universe of his own biographical stories and also personal interests and background, with creation myth and also icons from American culture and from mystical traditions he's interested in. So Matthew Barney is very interested in the idea of transcendence of the human body. A very important aspect in his work, and especially in the Cremaster Cycle, is his own personal background as a sportsman. So his work includes performative aspects. In some ways, as Cindy Sherman, he creates and performs different characters through the films as a way of expressing personal ideas, but also creating these narratives which are connected to storytelling. So always his ways of telling a story through the video. And also what's interesting about the work of Matthew Barney, and here there are perhaps some connections with the work of Joseph Beuys, is that although the narratives he creates in his films and artwork are always fiction, they normally include components of real life. So characters from real life, real people and their stories, including himself, and also actions and performances that take place in the real world. So, for example, in another of his, maybe the most commercial of his work, which was done together with his, at the time, life partner Björk, was a drawing from the Drawing Restraint series, and we see that through this journey, this story, the story which is told, a lot of the action develops inside a ship, and the crew of this ship is working a lot in producing tableau and sculptural elements and things that are in the end that are the end result of this long process of creating the work. So in this sense, the work is time-based, not just because it incorporates film, but it's time-based because it works with transformation processes, similarly to the work of Beuys, and transformation processes that really have to do with how you have an idea and put that idea into form under different conditions through a certain amount of time, and then following how this process develops. So in this sense, it's also more focused on the process and less on the end result. So through the process of these videos, which are a form of fiction and at the same time a form of documentation of the work which is done, there is always this component of, through time, producing the work, and then normally these pieces, the sculptures, drawings, etc., which are produced through this amount of time, are later installed in a museum or gallery context, where they attain a different, even another layer, another character, and another meaning, while at the same time functioning as results or testimonies of the creation of these myths. So it's very, very complex work. A lot of people have written about it, but it's definitely influential. So you have here some examples of Barney's work and aesthetics. So many examples from the Cremaster, of course, but then more recently the epic River of Fundament, which explores eroticism and Egyptian mythology. And Barney's most recent work, Redoubt, which is from 2019. Another artist that I want to mention in this context of time-based art is Bob Wilson, or Robert Wilson. And Robert Wilson is really also, in some way, similarly to Matthew Barney, one artist that really works across different media and not just exploring one kind of media. So he's very interested in bringing together opera, working with the building, watercolor, chair design, choreography, dancing, working with voice, working with representation, and in many. But he's mostly known as a director, theater and opera director. But the work I also would like to show you here, especially in this context of the still life, is he's and also of time-based art, of course, the video portrait. So here we really see that Robert Wilson really wants to explore a variety of media, to working with lighting, costume, makeup, choreography, gesture, voice, also to create a narrative. So he has a very specific, also very idiosyncratic visual style that it's easily identifiable. So more recently working with HD and very precise, crisp light effects, so that we immediately recognize his aesthetic. So Robert Wilson really developed this very strong, iconic theatrical language, and you have here some examples of a collaboration with Marina Abramovich, The Life and Death of Marina Abramovich, which it's fictionalized, staged presentation of based on real facts on the life and memories of Marina Abramovich, in which she performs also herself, or performed also on stage. So it's a way of telling her story, also from her own subjective point of view, and staged in a theatrical context. And this is one of the most relevant theater pieces, contemporary theater pieces, involving also, for example, another very important actor, Willem Dafoe. More recently, we have also from Bob Wilson, Lulu, which was staged in 2011 in Berlin, where we have also this characteristic theatrical language, very recognizable, but incorporating this story of Lulu and many ideas and commentary on German culture and also on German aesthetics. Another from 2015, another example from Robert Wilson's work, Faust. And you can see from the different works that the use of lighting and the use of color is pretty consistently used as a language in his work. Also more recently, Pelléas and Melisandre. And we see images that often have some allusions also to, we could say, also to surrealism, but in their crispness and color, there's also definite elements of minimalism, which are quite radical in terms of stage design. and more recently The Messiah from 2020, which definitely is a reference to the work of stage designer Appia, Rudolf Appia, from the early 20th century. And here we also see some components that allude to surrealism. And even more recently, we have a collaboration between Robert Wilson and Lady Gaga. Lady Gaga, who is also, besides being a pop star, pop singer, she has brought performance art to the mainstream. So she definitely presents herself as a performance artist, although it's also not a consensus if she's really a performance artist or not in the truest sense. But she works with performance art, and most recently she made this collaboration with Robert Wilson that she wanted to explore ideas on the topics of torture and classical representation, and so they did this collaboration where some images from the collection of the Louvre are recreated by Lady Gaga in video portraits. So this time-based art films, so to say, where Lady Gaga poses as reenacting these characters from the paintings. For example, Marat from The Death of Marat, or Saint Baptist as the severed head of Saint Baptist, and we see Lady Gaga performing these roles or reenacting these characters in very slow motion, very classically composed, carefully constructed images and narratives. And you have the link, so this is free access virtual exhibition, and I definitely recommend. And we will end our cycle of lectures, or in this lecture today, with the work of David Lynch, who I am mentioning now in this context of time-based art. David Lynch is mostly known as a filmmaker. I consider him a film artist and time-based artist, but he is an artist that comes from painting. So he started working with film because he studied painting, he wanted to be a painter, and he had this desire to make his paintings move. And then he started working with film and fell in love with film as a medium. I will not talk extensively about the work of David Lynch. You have a little bit of text in your files that gives you some a little bit more in-depth idea on his work. But you can see that he was very interested by artistic movements such as Surrealism, but also German Expressionism, and we cannot say that David Lynch is only a filmmaker, because he's also a painter, sound designer. He's in some ways also an activist and a philanthrope, so he's a very polydiverse artist and figure. He also works as a screenwriter, actor, photographer, lithographer, sculptor, furniture designer, and composer. So David Lynch is really a very idiosyncratic person, and also writes and talks a lot about creativity, which I definitely recommend. But in this context of time-based art, I will mention as example his work for the series Twin Peaks. Originally, the first season of Twin Peaks is from 1990, and we have here this image on page 156, where we definitely have the presence of some of Lynch's recurrent motives in his work, so the topic of life and death. There's many paradoxes and opposites in his work, the ideal, the comfortable, small town, familiar, but also the violent, the criminal, the dark, the seen and the unseen, the material world, metaphysical world and a possible underworld. So it's very, very complex, also creating a kind of self-referential mythology in this way. You could say almost similar to Matthew Barney. And so I chose Twin Peaks, specifically from 2017, the third season of Twin Peaks The Return, that few decades later, well, Twin Peaks was very successful in the 90s, and it was already a breakthrough because David Lynch really brought to this medium of television and picking up the tradition of the television soap, of telling a story with a series, with what would call the soap opera, and fused it with this genre, which is a little bit like the noir, or you could say here in Germany, the crime story, but also adding this layer of mystery and of the metaphysical and symbolic. While being presented as a soap opera, in many ways functioning like a soap opera. So using the melodramatic, the moving, the stereotypical, so all these things which are already in the format of the TV series. And the series was very successful also in terms of viewers, and it became a cult, really a cult classic. Although it was in the mainstream, which is also a very interesting aspect of Twin Peaks as a phenomenon. And more recently, in 2017, David Lynch released Twin Peaks The Return, so it's a return to the series and to the unsolved, or to these mysteries of the series of Twin Peaks. And here we see also the picking up what was the language which was developed, the visual and the narrative language which was developed for original Twin Peaks, and how it became fused with his own artistic language and recurrent narratives through David Lynch's work. So we see a lot of elements which have appeared in some of his films and in some of his artwork present in this universe of Twin Peaks. And we see it in the characters, we see it in a lot of the staged situations. So it is definitely in many ways, each scene is composed as a painting, you can definitely see it. And also the way often the characters speak and the characters move has this layer of we question what can be real and what can be unreal or otherworldly. So there is this also ambivalence. So you have many examples from images, and you see that each frame, each situation is carefully composed and constructed as an artwork. And also highly symbolic. Often some of these symbols are left open for interpretation. David Lynch is not interested in telling clear stories with a clear narrative. He's interested in working with intuition, with ambiguity, and with leaving things open for subjective interpretation, while at the same time presenting a very, in this way, precisely idiosyncratic universe of his interior world. And we definitely see here in Twin Peaks that a very strong influence of surrealism. So you have here some images, for example, on page 168 and also 169. And we end with a tableau from Twin Peaks, which is a little bit like a reenactment, could be a reenactment of the Last Supper, with some of the characters arranged together, and also with some symbolic objects of this universe of Twin Peaks, the owls, the coffee, the cherry pie, the donuts, the log. So anyone who is familiar with the universe of Twin Peaks, of course, recognizes these objects. If you are not familiar, you should become familiar, because this is definitely a wonderful artistic universe to explore and to delve into and to be inspired. And so I will leave you now with this last image of Twin Peaks, and we arrived at the end of our cycle of lectures on art history. And I hope you enjoyed these lectures, and I hope you felt inspired. It was very inspiring for me to collect and curate this material to show to you. It's sometimes even a struggle, because by collecting and seeing all this material, I also get a lot of ideas myself of how one can be inspired to also work and produce and make art and work with all these influences and so. So I hope that that you also experience the same feeling, and I hope that these works and this knowledge will inspire you in the present and in the future. And I also hope that whenever you're curious, that you can always come back to the channel and use this time-based performative project, which is the Corporeal Architecture channel, to revisit and learn and relearn, and also eventually to share what you are doing. That's the whole idea of the channel, that we can use it also as an open access education platform and as an open access exhibition room. And I'm looking forward to see the work you produced for these still lives, and I'm especially looking forward for our vernissage to open here the new playlist with the selection of works. And I'm very, very happy and excited to see your contributions. So until then, and until next time, I wish you all the best and see you soon. Bye bye.